It's the summer of 1999. In a suburb of Miami, a 15-year-old boy sits alone in his bedroom, his face lit by the glow of a screen. His name is Jonathan James. To the people who know him, he's a quiet kid who's good with computers. But right now, Jonathan is breaking into the United States Department of Defense. And within weeks, he'll be inside the computers of NASA, reading the code that keeps astronauts alive in orbit. He's 15 years old, and he's about to become the first juvenile in American history sent to prison for hacking. To understand how a teenager ended up inside some of the most secure networks on Earth, you have to go back to a quiet street in Pinecrest, Florida. Jonathan James was born in December of 1983. His father was a computer programmer, and from the age of 6, Jonathan was drawn to the machine humming in the family home. By the time he was a teenager, computers weren't a hobby, they were an obsession. He taught himself to program. He taught himself how networks talked to each other. And somewhere along the way, he stopped asking what a computer was allowed to do and started asking what it could do. Online, he went by a different name. Not Jonathan, Comrade. And Comrade was about to go looking for doors that were never meant to be opened. In the summer of 1999, Jonathan found one. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency is a division of the U.S. Department of Defense. Its job is to protect the United States from nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. It is not the kind of place a 15-year-old is supposed to be able to reach. But Jonathan slipped inside and installed a hidden back door on one of its servers. Then he waited and listened. Using a simple piece of software called a packet sniffer, he quietly intercepted more than 3,000 messages sent between government employees. He collected usernames. He collected passwords, including credentials for at least 10 official military computers. To the Department of Defense, its network was secure. To Jonathan, it was an open book. But the Department of Defense wasn't the target that would change his life. That was NASA. Jonathan broke into NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama and began downloading source code, proprietary software that NASA valued at $1.7 million. It wasn't just any code. It was the software that controlled the physical environment of the International Space Station, the temperature and the humidity that keep human beings alive in the vacuum of space. When NASA realized someone was inside, they did the only thing they could. They shut the systems down for about 3 weeks while they figured out what had happened. And when they finally traced the intrusion, it didn't lead to a foreign government or a rival power. It led to a bedroom in Miami and a boy who wasn't old enough to drive. Years later, Jonathan would shrug the whole thing off. The famous NASA code, he said, was junk, not worth anything close to what they claimed. He wasn't trying to sabotage the space station. He was, in his words, just studying how to write programs in C. On January 26, 2000, the knock came. Agents from the Department of Defense and NASA raided the James family home. Jonathan was 16. What happened next made history. Jonathan pleaded guilty. Because he was a minor, he was sentenced to house arrest, probation until his 18th birthday, and a ban on touching a computer for fun. But a year later, when he violated that probation, he was sent to serve 6 months in federal custody. With that, Jonathan James became the first juvenile ever incarcerated for hacking in the United States. The prosecutor who put him away was a federal attorney named Stephen Hyman, a name that, years later, would surface again in another case involving another young hacker named Aaron Swartz. For a while, it looked like Jonathan's story might have a second act. He was out. He was still brilliant. He talked about starting a computer security company, using everything he'd learned to protect systems instead of breaking them. But the government wasn't finished with him, and neither was his past. In 2007, the United States was rocked by one of the largest data breaches it had ever seen. A criminal crew led by a hacker named Albert Gonzalez had stolen tens of millions of credit and debit card numbers from major retailers, including the company TJX. The Secret Service launched a massive investigation, and in the paperwork there was a mysterious figure, an unnamed associate, referred to only by his initials, JJ. Investigators believed JJ was Jonathan James. In January of 2008, Secret Service agents raided Jonathan's home. They raided his brother's home. They raided his girlfriend's home. They tore his life apart, looking for a connection to the TJX breach. But here's the thing. They never found the evidence. Jonathan James was never charged. He insisted, over and over, that he had nothing to do with it. But he had seen how this ended for people like him. He had already spent time behind bars for curiosity, and now he was convinced the government intended to make him a scapegoat for a crime he didn't commit. On May 18, 2008, Jonathan James was found dead in his home. He had taken his own life. He was 24 years old. He left behind a note, 5 pages long. In it, he wrote that he had no faith in the justice system, and that this was the only way left for him to take back control. I honestly had nothing to do with TJX, he wrote. And then, near the end, sitting in jail for 20, 10, or even 5 years for a crime I didn't commit, that is not me winning. I die free. Jonathan James was 15 when he walked through the digital front door of the Department of Defense. He was 16 when the government made an example of him. And he was 24 when he decided the only freedom left to him was the one he could choose himself. He broke into NASA, looking for something to learn. In the end, the system he outsmarted as a child was the same one he could never quite escape. Comrade logged off for the last time at 24. A kid who could break into anything except a way out.